You're listening to a Very Spatial Podcast, episode 715, June 11th, 2023.
Hello and welcome to our Very Special Podcast. I'm Jesse.
I'm Sue.
I'm Barb.
And this is Frank.
And this week we're talking about, a month's worth of stuff, kind of. Just a section of that month's worth of stuff, because it's been a month. Sue and I have been to Japan. We had technical difficulties, unfortunately, which I think frustrated Frank to no end.
Yeah. We had a great interview, and it didn't. It said it was, but then there was nothing. And then I was like, well, can you read it over here? And it was like, no, that's not a file we recognize. And anyway, it doesn't matter. It was
Computers.
A whole thing.
So, yeah. Recording tech is not always your friend. And so then we had colds, first me, then Sue. And so now, finally, after 5 weeks seems right.
Yeah.
We return.
A very spatial hiatus.
Unintentional, as it was.
Still a little gravelly from the recovering cold. So,
But today we're going to talk about some things. And they were the events that go on in May and early June every year that we talk about generally to some extent in the newses. But I think because of some of the words that were tossed out this time and some of the expectations of what's coming in the next year, that it requires a little bit more conversation than the past. And of course, that's Microsoft's Build conference, so their dev conference, Google I/O, their dev conference, and Apple's WWDC, their dev conference. And so I have, of course, an interest in the fact that we have one of those who spent a lot of their time talking about, quote, spatial computing, unquote. We have another of those who laid out how to create better, quote, geospatial immersive experiences, unquote. And the other just kind of throwing AI at everything. So I think, between those three conferences, there's a lot to kind of talk about this year. So
Can we start with the single biggest, most important thing of all the conferences?
Okay. What is that?
Windows 11 supports RAR.
That is, in fact. Now, if Windows 11 also now supports tar and gzip, then we've got something to talk about.
It does support gzip. I don't know about tar, but RAR and gzip are now supported in Windows 11, at least in the previews. I don't know if it's official yet, but oh, thank God.
So
thank God.
somebody has to, because I will go off on a whole rant, like I think Frank would be about to as well, about this. So what is the importance of gzip in our world?
Too many people use it. That's the importance. It's a way of zipping. Okay. And so is RAR, and so is tar. Doesn't exactly zipping. Okay. So there's two parts here, right? One is putting all the things into one thing, and the other part is squishing it down to something smaller.
And the gzip.
Normally we think of zipping as doing both, but a lot of people don't realize it does both. Before that, in the Unix world, as Jesse said, there's the tarballing, which is putting it into one thing, and then the gzip, which is squishing it down. And the only reason you squish it down is to make it, smaller to transport over the interwebs. In the day of broadband, I don't know how important that is, but it doesn't matter because there was zip, and then there was gzip, and then there was RAR. And if you were Linux-based or Unix-based and whatsoever, you would tarball it, which I've never liked the term tarball, but that's neither here nor there. And then you would gzip it to squish it down, and then you could download it, which would be great, except for you're on Windows and you download gzip and it would go, I don't know what this thing is. I've never heard it my entire life. Oh, really? A specification's been around since like 1974. You've never heard of ever in your entire life. So you'd have to go download another application. Usually it would harass you and go, hey, give $10 for this application. You go, I don't want to. I just want to open the data and read the data in. I think I went on a rant like Jesse said he was going to go on. But the fact that Windows 11 now does it all natively is so nice.
Or will soon.
Will soon.
Yes. And so, whether you're getting Landsat data, LiDAR data, just geospatial data of any size.
A ton of government data. The governments in particular liked using that, particularly U.S. government, but I think the British government did too. So any governmental data tended to fall that.
Yeah.
For a whole lot
and
of
still
reasons.
does. Unless you're, doing a a REST connection via the web, you're still downloading in one of these formats. And so you had to go get another application like 7-Zip or WinRAR or something like that to be able to even get to your data that you wanted to utilize. And, I agree for most data with Frank's statement about, do we really need to zip it? But whenever we are talking about LiDAR, we are talking about something like Landsat data. It allows you to download 1 gig as opposed to the unzipped 1.5 gig, 2 gigs of data. So it's useful even in the age of high speed internet.
And the single package.
That is the most important part. Yes, especially for things for shape files, for instance.
Yeah, the shape file that is not a file. Shape files that are files.
Yeah,
that's a whole other thing.
So that I cannot disagree with Frank on that. That is perhaps the most important of all of these announcements.
But it not necessarily VerySpatial. Not necessarily. It's tangentially associated. So
it is the one that will have the most impact on our day-to-day lives when it gets released and when our institutions, I don't know about yours, but ours still has us on 10.
So let's just go on a little mini tangent rant here for a bit on Windows 11. Okay. So Windows 11, the biggest problem with Windows 11 was always the question of why, because it doesn't really do anything that Windows 10 doesn't do just fine. Windows 10 is a perfectly great operating system. I got a new computer at work because the computers they issue us aren't really GIS-able. I mean, they are, but only if you don't mind taking a lot of coffee breaks. So I got them to buy me a proper GIS machine. And it came with Windows 11, which I was like, okay, I'll go ahead and upgrade to Windows 11 at home, which I've done on my desktop, but I have not done on my laptop because it won't do it. So I've kind of moved over to Windows 11. And what I will say is that they're adding features increasingly that make it worthwhile. Every one of those features could be added to 10 if they wanted to, but they don't want to. You're absolutely right. If your gut tells you Windows 12 is going to be the best, it probably will whenever that comes out. But Windows 11 is pretty cool. And there's a lot of neat things that I like, little enhancements. The biggest one outside of this new zip thing is you can have tabbed Windows Explorer, which is really kind of nice. Be able to just have multiple tabs in one Windows Explorer instead of 19 Windows Explorers open like I do.
Is that in the current build?
It is in the current build.
Oh, I haven't tested it yet. I thought it was still on the preview build.
Yeah, no, it's in the current building, which is really cool. The only thing I don't like about it is they switch over to icons, and I always forget which freaking icon. I'm looking for the word copy paste, and it's actually icon, and I have to. That's the only part I haven't got my brain switched to yet. But
yeah, the context menu, the right click menu, has also got that going on.
Yeah, and it's just I haven't got my brain around that yet. But I mean it's a good OS. It really is. It's not like older off year versions. I don't know how else to call them.
It's like little mini upgrades.
Yeah.
It's basically 10 with just a slightly different UI, but a lot of differences under the hood that you don't really see that can have impact sometimes. So Sue has Bluetooth issues sometimes with 11.
Do. It's very frustrating. It's a known issue.
But
yes,
it's not a big issue. Dev conferences.
Yeah.
Was there anything that kind of jumped out?
I liked your description of what they were focusing on, but I was trying to figure out which one was the one that was basically AI, yay? Because I was going, well, do you mean, the Apple or do you mean Microsoft? Because they both sort of had that permeate throughout.
So I would characterize it this way. Apple talks about AI the least. Google talks about AI a little bit more with trepidation. And Microsoft is jumping in and saying, we don't care about you doing anything. We want it to be generated for you. So it's kind of if I had a visual right now, it would be a little low bar for Apple, even though they're doing a lot. A little low bar for Google, even though they're doing a lot. And just a person diving into a swimming pool for Microsoft.
I kind of feel like this is a function at some level of how much they've been engaged in it already. Like Apple didn't talk about it nearly as much, and I think part of it is because we've been doing that for like a long time. Because AI is what underpins all the really cool things in taking a picture, on your iPhone or something like that. And then Google has been doing it kind of the back end on search level stuff forever and a day too. And also like the facial recognition that you have in Google Photos. At some level, that's all AI back in. Whereas Microsoft, I kind of feel like they were a little behind the ball, and so they made a big deal about it, even though Chat GPT is the big thing that everyone's talking about. I feel like they haven't been as vocal in the past of how much it's underpinning their stuff already.
But it was. So
It was.
it's the thing is, because whenever you go back and look at some of the old, and Apple had been hosting machine learning conferences, I don't know, for not quite a decade, but close to it at this point. Definitely before COVID, and I think they might have kind of tapered off once COVID hit, and AI became, more explosive. But everybody was showing up at those conferences and talking about what they were doing. It's just Microsoft has thrown so much. Can't even keep the three companies separate at this point. Microsoft has thrown so much money at OpenAI that they just feel like we've got to put it out there. And really, they're less focused on hardware, and so their focus on that interaction of software has to be, currently at least, where they're throwing a lot of their ducks. That was weird. I'm throwing ducks. But go ahead.
Well, you're throwing them into the pond, and maybe they'll get in a row.
Yeah.
And that's like a future episode. Well, interestingly, when thinking about those three things, the focus on the sort of the Apple, which by the way, the Apple headset, I still like design wise. I just have many questions, but somewhat of their focus on that. Again, something not for the general public, really, at $3,400? It's
$3,500.
Yeah. So anyway, in terms of pricing, right? But that's a similar thing to what is already, we've already seen with the HoloLens generation 1 and 2, right? So, and that, but the interesting thing about, so some of the things that you highlighted is the, which got under the radar for me, I have to admit, the geospatial crater from Google Maps, but those for me, those two focusing or talking or highlighting about immersive experiences again and interfaces for it. But the AI is part of that, right? Because one of the things that has stalled a lot of that, I think, is that ability to have an immersive world where things are going on in the background, right? So to simulate what seems like real time, you have to have systems changing and moving and updating, and you have to have that dynamism, and it has to be reactive in order to give that experience. And so AI is another part of that backbone. And so just across different things, but interestingly, I think more in relation to each other than maybe we're thinking about. And so that I find really interesting. And I think I really want to delve a little bit more into what they're thinking on the Google IO side with Geospatial Creator, especially.
Well, I mean, and you have the conversation point from Apple that they laid this out as I can't remember if it's the third or fourth wave, but you had the move to desktop, you had the move to the internet, you had the move to mobile, and now this is a move to spatial computing, that these headsets, and again, we cannot say this by any means is new. We've talked about AR headsets, not us, because we haven't been around since they started back in the 70s, but over our 17, 18 years, we've been talking about them for most of that time. And everything from making fun of the old Nintendo headset to talking about the evolution of Meta, which was Oculus originally, and then looking at the HoloLens, looking at Magic Leap, and now, we kind of expected at some point in time that there'll be a glasses versus like a stereo version of Google Glass from Apple, but instead what we're getting at the beginning is this full VR headset that they're using cameras to convert to AR. Whereas, of course, Microsoft's, for the same price with the HoloLens, is using a different approach than using those cameras. It's still using cameras for hand tracking, those type of things. But it's more about having these panels that are more or less opaque that allow you to see through it. So we've seen this idea of spatial computing. It's not new, but it was kind of what Apple hung their entire presentation on, was that term.
Yeah, and I think the headset is an interesting entry. It's a very Apple thing though, right? That there's a lot of activity going on and Apple says, "Oh, let's take a step back and figure out how to do this a little more cleanly, a little more succinctly." I don't want to use the word better, but that would be, I think, what most Apple fans would say. And sometimes they get it right and sometimes they don't. Obviously, the iPhone is, I think, arguably the biggest success of getting it right in maybe technology history, but certainly in Apple's history. And so the question is this the right approach? It's not the right price point, I don't think.
I don't think it's meant to be the right price point, though. I think this is just them getting out there ahead of everyone with, like you said, something that's very Apple. And it's not necessarily what everyone's going to end up using out of everything presented, but it is the biggest flash that's getting most people talking about it. And I think part of that is the price point getting people talking.
I think the word pro is key there because, of course, all their pro products cost more. So now they have the ability to release a non-pro version or even an SE version for like $1,500, like the Quest Pro, and then another one at the $500 price point, which would be the SE, which was where the current Quest line sits.
Which they announced a new one like 2 days, 3 days like that.
Yeah, they wanted to make sure they at least got a little bit of the attention, right?
Yeah, it was like it's a pretty compelling little product for if you're into that. If you bought into that general ecosystem. It's 3 now, I think it's a Quest 3 or 4.
Yeah,
I can't remember.
it's a 3.
And it's what, $400 or something, $350. It's a pretty good little product.
And amusingly, it's I would argue that it's probably equal to the Pro, which is $1,500. But we'll see whenever it actually comes out how it plays out.
Yeah.
Well, I think that'll be interesting too, because to go back kind of to the term spatial computing, and let's see if you disagree with me on this, right? Is that we're still operating with 2 different paradigms of how we see these immersive experiences, right? So the Meta Quest, at least now in its current iterations and from what I understand, right, is the VR approach, right? That you're placed into a pre-rendered world. And that world can change and update and look more realistic, less realistic, but that's it. You're being inserted into a world that's rendering around you. And so therefore the device is controlling everything that you visually see, right? The AR side, the HoloLens, some of those others are you're in the space, moving through space, and the computing is happening around you, right? You're you because they want the world to filter through. But it's a very different approach than both on hardware and software and how we generate things. And so I think that, and HoloLens kind of didn't, the first gen HoloLens, right, had both options, right? They had applications in there that were full on VR, and then there was the AR where you could see the world around you. So there they were trying to straddle both, and they leaned toward the AR side. But I think that there's still some question as to which way we want to go with the full on immersion, right? And or even if it's full on, which way we want to go with our idea of computing around you, right? Whether you're in the space or the computing is happening, kind of being generated. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
So we have, I agree that we have the traditional VR, which the Apple Vision Pro does fall into because it is completely based on occluded lenses. You're not seeing through, you're seeing what a camera is showing you on the other side. People aren't seeing your eyes, they're seeing what an LED screen is recreated of a lenticular representation of your eyes that you're seeing. So yeah, I mean, it's still in that VR perspective. And then you have the AR, the Magic Leap, the HoloLens, and a couple of others. And yeah, I think that there's some of that, but there's also the fact that no matter which one we're talking about, because now even the Oculus 2 has really crappy black and white, grayscale, whatever you want to call it, cameras, but allows for pass-through. The Quest Pro, much better cameras for pass-through. The 3, as announced, will have better cameras than at least the 2 does, and in color. So I think the key here, whether we're talking about true augmented reality or VR with pass-through, is sensors. And some of those sensors are to record you and your hand gestures, your facial expression, so that it can be conveyed through the software. But a lot of it is just to understand the world. And that was where you hear the term spatial early in whenever we're talking about the HoloLens's first release. Because whenever it's looking around itself to figure out where to put things, augmented or VR, in the space, it's capturing the space around you. So it's using its cameras first to record what's around you, more so than you yourself. And so it's all about sensors, I think, in spatial computing. I don't think they really said that so much. And you have the whole fact that, whenever we're talking about HoloLens, you're talking about this very VR 3D space. Whenever we're talking about Meta, we're talking about very much 3D space. But that was very limited in conversation in terms of what they talked about for Apple's, is the 3D space. It was about putting your 2D information into 3D space around you. But they only talked a couple of times about the actual 3D capabilities of having that stereoscopic. And I assume that's going to come over the next 6 months as they're building out, and more companies are building tools within that environment, or apps, as we'll call them, I'm sure. But it just wasn't there because they were pushing their apps, which are all screen-based. So, yeah, I think, it's really about the sensors, that, to come back to what I was saying. Sorry.
Well, yeah, I think in this generation. So, but I still do think the jury's out on what people, the visionaries, what they see in their mind's eye or whatever, to quote Scott Pilgrim, right? As ultimately the setting and uses, right? So,
thoughts?
Yeah, so I think that the interesting bit for me on Apple is, I wanted to use the word egocentric, but I don't know that that's the right word. Essentially, the person-centricness of it, the where you're at in the space around you, what people can see of you. Like, I don't really understand. I don't really understand the utility in showing a person's face when they're wearing the glasses. That's just a little, like, a neat party trick to me, but I'm like, I don't really get why. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. But it was very much grounded in the reality. Not so much in the augmented virtual side of that equation. It was, let's talk about reality and then enhance it. As opposed to, it feels like philosophically the vibe and I've blanked on Valve's version, what it's called. Anyway, and the Oculus, they've Index, is the Index. They've taken a much more of a, we're going to replace reality with something else. And that's why one of the reasons I think that it's been so heavily pitched as the augmented reality part of it, not so much the virtual part of it, piece of the equation. And I thought that was kind of an interesting take, if you will, on the whole thing. And I don't know, to Sue's point, I don't know exactly what piece of that's going to win out. I think Apple's betting on the fact the reason this hasn't become so widespread popular is that it's not egocentric. It's not focusing on the reality bit and extending it from there. That's what it felt like. I don't know that they're right, but I also don't know that they're wrong. For me, it isn't, but I'm not necessarily the typical use case.
So to me, it gave me very much Ready Player One vibes, seeing it. But what I was thinking was going back to what Sue said is in some ways, especially when technology like this comes up and when changes happen, that I don't know if what necessarily gives us the best immersion, what gives us the best actual spatial computing is going to be what wins out in its final form. That's going to be determined by the public and users. I don't know which one yet I'm leaning towards, but I do know that even the one that I think might be the most worthwhile for what I would say is actual spatial computing, actual immersion, may not be the version that is the one that everyone else accepts. I think we've seen times when the best version of a technology isn't the one that became the most popular.
And some of it might, I was just thinking, some of it might boil down a little bit to practicality, right? Because even though, and I think that the Ready Player One reference kind of is a good example, right, of what the Oasis could be, that it was on multiple scales and levels, right? All the way from rendering completely fantastical environments to, just doing something simple as an interface to, pay bills and those types of things. So that's interesting, right? Because one of the great just basically practical issues with a rendered world, right, is that you have to render them and store them in order then to have them retrieved and positioned and displayed. And so that creates a whole infrastructure that you've got to have in terms of data rendering storage, right? There's been a lot of work on speeding up rendering and those types of things. And on the other side, if you're able to capture information and render in real time, and there's a lot of work, because this relates to work that's already going on in self-driving cars and all kinds of other research. But that particular thing, enhancing reality by just simply rendering in real time, may solve one problem. That is, you don't have to have a storage space. But on the other hand, there's also work, I think, and I haven't spent a lot of time looking at this yet, where there's a move to try to get that procedural generation of more fantastical or non-realistic types of things. So that's, I think, part of it is a recognition that for these types of immersive experiences to go on for a long time, to involve as many infinite possibilities, is that there's the very much upfront kind of thing like the sensors and all that, but there's also this other infrastructure that we've talked about lots of times in different episodes that has to go on behind the scenes as well.
Can we jump to a new technology?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. So what do you guys think about Google's Bard? Have you played with this yet?
No. Tell us how Bard is different from other large language models.
GPT or the other such things. Honestly, it's got a cooler name. Let's acknowledge that. Bard's a really good. It's a solid name. Go on, you guys, Google, for picking a great name. But I'll have to say, I've been playing with it for a bit, and it works. But it's not the tool that I would grab very often. I think, and it makes sense that ChatGPT is better because it's been, it's out of the gate quicker. Bard is still in, is it alpha? I don't know exactly what state it's in, but I think it's in a user testing, early adopter, try to refine it to make it better. But the really interesting thing to me, and I think this is getting back to Jesse's, mention that Google's mention of AI was, compared to Microsoft or Apple's, well, better than Apple's. But anyway, is that it really feels like a slightly advanced search engine from Google. Most of the results tend to come back not dissimilar to what I would find in a search, which is, I think, indicative of the amount of AI that is in Google search already. So I think it's kind of interesting that it doesn't feel radically better. In some ways it is, but it doesn't feel radically better than what Google's already doing, because Google's already doing all of that. And I kind of find it fascinating that if I'm right, that Google's and Apple haven't really been ringing this bell very loud. And I'm curious because you would think, as big of a splash as Chat GPT and other AI has made in the last, 9 months or so, that is exploded, as a semi-disruptive technology, that they haven't talked about this before, at least at that level.
Yes. I mean, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think we hear a lot more about AI whenever Apple and Google are releasing new versions of Android and iOS. And that's really where they're focusing. Even though it's in all of their technologies, it's the only place that they think that the public, the user, would be interested in it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that whereas Microsoft is trying to get everybody to take advantage of it through whatever tools they have because they've spent a lot of money on it, Google and Apple are still a little bit more, we want you to use this in places that you'll notice it, but you're going to use it everywhere because it's in the background of all this other stuff that you're doing. You just don't know it. So we'll mention it here whenever we're talking about photos because you can see your photos getting better and you might not want to know why. This is why. But we're not going to tell you that we're using it in the background of search because we just have been all the while anyway. Does that make sense?
It might creep you out. But yeah, I think that it's really interesting that, when you look at Microsoft, they've really splashed everything out against the wall, everything AI, when they're talking about it. And for their users, it might be something where it's an enhancement, like a big plus on everything they've got. Whereas for Google and Apple, it's something that, like you said, it's part of the backbone behind everything going on, but it might not be something that their users want to know as much about because it make them feel like they have less control over things. At least that's what I think.
And just not know what it means.
Yeah.
That too. We wouldn't understand what it means for something to be AI, but I still think that we're in a minority. A lot of my students, they think it's this magical thing that'll help them pass tests, but they don't really understand what all machine learning and AI and neural networks and expert systems can really do for them. And that's things we cover in classes to a slight extent, at least. But they still just, they're like, really? No, I don't get that. So I don't know. Maybe that's just my perspective on it. I don't know. And AI will have to tell me.
Yeah, there you go. Well, I think that AI works best when you don't know anything about it. And I don't mean that you don't know how AI works. I mean, you don't know that it's happening, right? That's when the magical box just does the thing that the magical box does. This is where I think that, I'm sure Chrome does this too, but Apple's the one I'm most familiar with because I'm an iPhone user, but iPhone taking pictures is the most brilliant implementation of AI to my mind, because at the end of the day, I don't really care as long as I get a cool photo, right? I see something cool, I want to take a picture of it. Now I have that forever and I'm happy. That's all I really want. And it just kind of does all this stuff in the background. And it goes, I'm going to mess with the f-stops and move with this and all this stuff. Like, I don't care. Just do the photo thing and give me a cool picture. If I want to get nerdy about it, I've got a fancy camera that I can turn all the dials and set the settings and all those priorities, the speed and the aperture. I can do that, but most of the time I just want to take a picture and I want to move on with life. And I think that, and the same thing with a filter. I want to put a filter on it and it just does a thing. And so that's a brilliant implementation of AI to my mind. When you know that AI is happening is where it becomes problematic. And that's where it becomes, like Barbara said, it creeps me out. Or I go, I don't know about that. Or how do I know the computer's smart enough to know all that stuff? It's a real issue that things are happening. And we've seen a lot of negative implications of this, implementations and implications. I created one word from two. I didn't mean to do that. Of this, from political manifestations to online bots and all that sort of stuff like that. There's issues, but it does work best, I think, when you just don't realize there's AI behind it. And I think that may be why a lot of students just go, I don't really care. I click the thing and the magic thing kills me the thing. I'm happy. And what I think, going back to the AR VR thing, I think that to some extent that Apple may have hit upon something here by just saying, don't worry about the magic behind the boxes. Don't worry about the mirrors and the smoke and all. It just kind of works, and how it works doesn't really matter. And that's somewhat comforting, I think, to most users, because they don't want to get into the weeds of how this works or doesn't work. It creates problems for society, but I think that it is the magic sauce that gets a technology adopted. And I think ChatGPT is a good name, but now we know it's ChatGPT AI, which is why everyone's flipping out about it. If you're in higher education, it feels like it's dominated. Every conversation I seem to be involved in is either funding or ChatGPT problems. That seems to be all we talk about anymore.
For me, who's heard about AI my whole life, because my father worked in AI from the early days. For me, seeing people freak out, but also, seeing ChatGPT being the epitome right now of AI, it just feels so limiting. Because Jesse, like you said, there is so much more to it, and there is so much that it can do, and it could potentially do, and has done in the background to improve our lives. And there are concerns, but the concerns people are having seem to be themselves limited by not understanding the scale and scope of everything. And I think some of what we saw from AI from Google, Apple, and Microsoft was what they were calling the next generation, but this big splash. And so what's coming next? And Frank, I think you're right. I think this might be about getting people to accept, here it is, and here's what it can do, but they're dialing back, before the real stuff comes.
So I think since we're kind of wrapping up on time, there's one of the things that we kind of started with. I think Sue mentioned it at the beginning, and that's Geospatial Creator from Google. So we talked about Apple's use of spatial computing, the role of AI in all of these. But let's talk for a second about Geospatial Creator, aka AUGeo 2.0. Just kind of, it's funny. I'm sitting here looking at this, and if you played with AUGeo, which was Esri's augmented reality app back, how long was it, like 5-6 years ago? I'm not even sure it's supported anymore. I think I still have it on my phone, but I'm not sure you can actually download it from either of the app stores. But you could go into ArcGIS Online. You could place some locators in a map, and then you could walk to those locations, and the locators that you put in there would pop up. Well, oftentimes kind of text bubbles popping up, those type of things. I'm not sure that you could do 3D models with it back in the day, because it was one of their early technology things that were utilizing the back end of ArcGIS Online. So it's not by any means, it wasn't as powerful as what you can do now with cell phones. But Geospatial Creator is just kind of that. You can go in various tools, including Adobe Aero and Unity, which have hooks in already for this, apparently, in the current versions. You can put something in there, a 3D model, a pointer, whatever you want it to be, that people can see whenever they're in the real world with their phone holding it up for the AR view, and these things will pop up in your view. And that was literally what AUGeo was.
Yeah, it wasn't, and
is.
Well, there was a non-Esri one. Was it Erasmus?
There's others as well.
Yeah, there were lots of others. So, it's not so much that it's new, but I think that it's getting a tweaked kind of message, and where does it fit now, and some other stuff kind of thing that it's a moment in time kind of situation. That
you can create those, what was it, Minority Report moments, where you have the interaction that's going on the building through this by basically utilizing and leveraging the location plus the millions and billions and trillions of points that Google's pulled from the photos. So you can actually put these things in a location, and it'll use spatial computing to find where you are in relation to a particular building, not just using your X, Y, and your compass direction, but also matching up to the physical environment, so that whenever you're putting something on a building, it'll actually sit in the correct place on the building. So it's, it's just kind of awesome what it can do.
Yeah,
just kind of curious to see if people will take advantage of it, because like Frank was saying, is AR, after all these years we've been looking at it, going to finally get used more?
Well, I think their choice of plugins suggests that, hey, now we see a set of developers that probably has better alignment in what the goals are, if you know what I mean. So like previously, a lot of those tools might not end up being used by people who had the design side, but like when you're talking about Aero and you're talking about Unity, those are people that have already gravitated to tools that they have a certain idea of how they're going to use them, I guess.
Yeah, but it's the user question, right?
Yeah, well, that is. I mean, I will say I'm a little disappointed that the Unity plugin is only Android and iOS, for example. But I see it. It's very much driven towards a mobile deployment, right? That you should be.
You have to have the camera. You have to be in the
yeah,
place,
exactly.
So.
I mean, I can in my head envision some other ways of using it, but the bulk, the vast majority of it would be.
You can explain those to me off
yeah,
mic.
So, anyway,
so I'll understand.
It's cool. It's also, the more I explore the AR, the less confident I get that it's going to have a good place in society. I can think of like one use case where I'm like, oh yeah, that makes clear sense. That's an obvious, good thing. And that is literally every demo I've ever seen has, and it's always contrived. It's not, does not work, but has an airplane mechanic looking at an engine and an AR showing where all the parts are. And I'm like, that makes sense to me. Or a pipeline technician or auto mechanic. That makes a lot of sense to me. Basically having the textbook, if you will, show up to augment what you're actually seeing. And so you can say, oh, I see how that's supposed to go.
Amusingly, my brother was used for a demo recently for one of those, because he works in printing, and the company wanted to capture, for training purposes, someone working on and fixing the printer whenever something went wrong, the machine. And these are room-sized printers, not your desktop printer. So it was kind of funny whenever he told the story yesterday about being captured for VR.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a use case. I go, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That is a good positive thing for AR. And then the next one I always hear is ads in the sky, which was the one most recent I saw, is that this notion of a cityscape, you have ads in the sky. And I'm like, no, I don't want this. I get annoyed when I'm playing a video game and there's an ad on a billboard for like a baseball game that would have an ad, but it's a real ad. That annoys me. Or I see it a lot because I don't play baseball games, but I do play driving games. You'll see it in driving games a lot. You'll drive around a cityscape and they'll have an ad for
billboards,
for whatever, Monster Energy drink or something. I don't know, whatever they're trying to, whoever bought into the ad, but it connects to a back-end ad service. That's where I see a lot of augmented reality going. And the one that I was going to mention, you pulled out quicker, Minority Report, and that was all selling things for the most part. So, this is I'm not sure I understand, and this is a whole nother conversation, but I'm not sure I've bought into the use case for augmented reality, except for the incredibly specialized technology use case. And if I, a person who is a junkie for this sort of stuff, who will buy anything, then he'll throw money at it to get it, because why not? If I'm struggling to see the use case for a greater society, I don't know how your average person goes, yeah, that's something I'll use.
See, I don't know. I'm with Sue, though. I think it's like, I don't know if you just can describe a technology as delightful, but like, I'm all for like the magical realism of it, the art that people are going to make, and just the, creativity they're going to bring to it when you get the people that have that bent. And that's what I'm looking forward to seeing. I don't know if it'll have a huge impact, but I think the impacts it's going to have is going to be a lot of fun, at least in that realm.
It's like they say about Velvet Underground, not everyone listened to them, but everyone who did started their own band.
Yeah, I can see a lot coming out of this. The people that have an opportunity to use it and bring their imagination to it, because just watching it, there's so many different things I could see that would make this fun and enjoyable. Although something else you said earlier brought me back to, but what about all the storage issues and the earth and all things that we haven't talked about that hopefully will be resolved before everyone's using all these things?
Yeah, I think definitely multiple conversations as we wait and see what kind of rolls out after these initial kind of, spectacular stage show kind of announcements and things. Just see what happens in the coming months.
So that's kind of it. Again, AI was big. This idea of geospatial tools, spatial computing continues to grow. Again, not new for any of these things, but just kind of a push this year in these areas from all the different keynotes, but a little bit of different focus on each. So I don't know. Of course, if you would like to go to one of these events or others, maybe we'll have some in the show note or in the podcast in the future. If you would like us to add yours, send us an email to podcast@veryspatial.com.
And if you'd like to reach us individually, I can be reached at stu@veryspatial.com.
I'm Barb at VerySpatial.com.
And you can reach me at frank@veryspatial.com.
I'm available at Kinda Spatial, except, of course, at Twitter. And you can find all of our contact information over at veryspatial.com/contact.
As always,
We're the folks from VerySpatial.
Thanks for listening.
And we'll see you in a couple of weeks.